We had 2 hyperinflations even without a war, and we took 13-0 from the currency. And the generalized repudiation of the currency led to what was the most successful stabilization program in the history of Argentina, which was convertibility. Although between 1991 and 2001 the average inflation was 9%, it is true that this level of inflation was concentrated between 1991 and 1992. And from 1993 until 2001, Argentina was among the countries with the least inflation in the world. Later, when the state was out of funding and fell into default, instead of trying to put the accounts in order, they decided to scam us again. In fact, if you look at the bills we had at that time, it said convertible legal cause, and today they are not. They did not have that designation. Therefore, they did not have the backing that those bills had, that is to say, the political cash scammed us again. But they did not say that that time or this time it was going to be different, and it was not different at all. I'm going to round up the numbers, I warn you, because later they are going to start with a number, the comma, I did not know what. I'm going to round up the numbers, I warn you, because later they are going to start with the comma, I do not know what. If I take the average inflation of the first period of the Kirchnerist regime, let's say what Néstor Kirchner at the head, the average inflation was 10%. In the second period of the Kirchnerist regime, that is, in the first presidency of Cristina Fernández Kirchner, the inflation made a jump to 20% on average. In the third period of the Kirchnerist regime, that is, the second presidency of Cristina Fernández Kirchner, the average inflation went up to 30%. Perhaps in the document that she published, she forgot to say that perhaps one of her ways of fighting inflation was to lie to her. That is, it does not seem to us that the formula is to break the thermometer, that is, the formula is to measure things. Or when so many are scared by the poor, where to reach poverty as well as to get out of poverty is not something that is generated instantly. It demands time, it demands genuine economic growth. If it does not appear from one day to the next because it does, or it disappears from one day to the next because it does. And among other things, as the poverty index bothered them, they considered it to be a stigmatizing measure and decided not to publish it anymore. That is, of course, that is how it is easy. Let's say drawing numbers must be much easier to achieve achievements and better show the performance of a government. Well, it is not the way we have decided to take. We have decided to tell the truth because we prefer to tell an uncomfortable truth rather than a comfortable lie. So let's say, at least, if you want to make criticisms, start by making an self-criticism that is costing the country quite a bit, which is for having lied to the numbers. Or the disasters that they did, for example, with the case of YPF, which is also going to cost us a lot to all Argentines. But not only that, later, during the Macri period, the average inflation ended up climbing to an average level of 40%. With which it is not an issue that inflation has now gained. In fact, Mr. Alberto Fernandez, the hitman autocrat, basically went with an inflation of 210%. But that does not reflect the dynamics that he had left, because as his government was advancing, inflation was advancing. And I remember when we had already won the elections and we were doing in finalizing details to get to the function. During the first week of December, the prices grew at a daily rate of 1%, that put in annual terms. The good thing is that I do not have to explain to you how a geometric type function works. In other words, you know how to compute exponentials, and the annual ask is 3,700%. However, in the first 15 days of December, that is, during the second week of December, there was a stronger acceleration. The average inflation went to be at 1.2% daily. That is to say that in reality, inflation had been traveling at 7,500% per year. And when you computed the different imbalances that the Argentine economy had in the monetary plan, remember that we were facing what was going to be the worst crisis in Argentine economic history, because it combined a surplus of money that was twice what we had in the previous Rodriguez, an experiment that involved the sextuplication of the inflation rate. Not only that, we also had an absolutely broken central bank. It was in an even worse situation than the one that Alfonsín had at the beginning of 1989, which ended with a 5,000% hyper-majorist. In addition, we have worse social indicators than those in 2001. Therefore, everything was given for a disaster. In addition, we had the equivalent of 4 monetary bases within the central bank. But in remunerated bases that generated the creation of indigenous money. We had $90,000 million in pesos. That is, in pesos, equivalent to $90,000 million. We had external debt payments of $25,000 million. But most of it was with the International Monetary Fund. But the program was done because the previous government had not fulfilled anything. Therefore, inflation was not generated by us. It was generated by these 20-something years of wild populism. The reality is that we describe inheritance, but we do not complain about inheritance. Because we are also going to be sincere, in normal conditions, fascia and temperature does not win a libertarian liberal in the presidency. Therefore, we are clear that the conditions under which we were going to arrive were going to be on the brink of total collapse. In that sense, for us it was fundamental. Apart from my job description, it has 2 things, and it is very clear. Which is, on the one hand, the demand to end insecurity, where this morning was that wonderful minister that I have, who is Dr. Boich, who is giving battle, and who, for example, has achieved the first month without homicide in Rosario. And the truth is that he is doing a truly exceptional job. So that part of the job description comes great. And the other part of the job description says that we have to eradicate inflation. So, as I was saying, inflation in Madrid was traveling from 54 per month. That is to 17,000% per year. And that was feasible because what you needed was to validate the fiscal deficit. To validate the quasi-fiscal deficit, I mean that the passes were went in one day. Let's say that there was the problem of the pit. There was the problem of the debt in pesos. Therefore, there was everything to validate that, plus the monetary surplus. And if you take the latest data of majorist inflation, the majorist is around 3%. And if you to that 3%, which is annualized, is something like a little more than 20. If you take away what we call induced inflation, which has to do with the 2% CR impact and international inflation, that gives about 2.5% and gives an inflation that annualized is 6%, which is part of the job description we are also fulfilling. Despite the fact that Patel and that some, let's say, piffed him so much, they resist to recognize it. So, beyond this, the point is how we got here. And now I'm going to make a small introduction of monetary theory that I hope that Chris takes note. Takes out the notebook and pencil and notes that what you have next to you will not help you at all, because they are the ones who generated this disaster. Basically, for one to have a diagnosis, he has to have a good theoretical framework. He has to understand what he is talking about, because if one does not understand what he is talking about, that of being betting on error type 2 is not something that works recurrently. Error type 1 is to do everything well and that it goes wrong. Error type 2 is to do everything wrong and that it goes well. And it is clear that, there you go, the theory won him by scandal to the cast. Let's say, in terms of the fact that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Now, to understand the nature of what inflation is. Inflation is the loss of the purchasing power of money. That is to say, it is a clearly different definition, that is to the general rise of prices. Because if for you inflation is a loss of the purchasing power of money, it means that there is an excess problem of money supply, and the problem is in the central bank. If you believe that in a general rise of prices, they are going to blame the price makers. That is to say, then they are going to depress control. It is a tool that 4,000 years ago we have evidence that it does not work. So, okay, then we have to understand the nature of money. Because clearly I ask you for forgiveness for having to explain this. But clearly we have to explain this to the obvious. If the Colossus who was here, he was Federico Sturzenegger, and what he had to deal with the cast. Look, I thought that before believing that we had to eliminate the central bank. I thought that there could be a central bank, and especially when, without a doubt, one of the most talented economists in the world was in charge of the central bank with a truly exceptional group. After what I saw that they did, I lost hope. And I decided that the best thing that can happen is not having a central bank. But I am also going to explain that now. In that sense, what one would have to explain is where the existence of money comes from. So, what is the economy like when it does not have money? Well, it is the currency economy, that is, if you exchange goods for goods. Now, if you have a currency economy, basically you have two problems. One is the problem of double coincidence. That is, you have to find someone who wants the good that you have to sell. But at the same time, that person has to want the good that you have. Which obviously raises a huge problem that causes a lot of transactions to be lost, with which there is a huge problem. And the other problem is that of invisibility, because it may be that I want to eat bread, and the bakery in the corner wants an economy talk. But the problem is how many kilos of bread. Obviously, those who, let's say, prior to being president, let's say a few kilos I can eat. So that raises a problem of invisibility. That is because, let's say, perhaps for what I would do for a kilo of bread, the conference is of no use to them. Now, the issue is that the human being, in the face of that situation, did not start crying. That is, and he did not call either, I want to eat bread. He did not call the state either. What did he do? He found the way around, he solved it, he leapt for the way around, and he fixed it somehow. And one of the things that human beings discovered was that there are goods that were exchanged more than others. Then they began to buy those goods that were exchanged much more, and they used them as an indirect exchange mechanism. Then suddenly they bought that good, and with that good, then they bought what they wanted. That is where the money appears. That is, the good of indirect exchange is a good that is used to make transactions. That is money. Then, in the face of this situation, different types of goods of direct exchange appeared throughout history, and that they officiated as money. First of all was cattle. And why was it cattle? Because the man was a nomad, and then he traveled with his own feed, that is, with cattle. Then it was something that they regularly exchanged, and then they used it as a good of indirect exchange. And then the money was cattle. Now then the man, let's say, became a sedentary. And when he became a sedentary, one of the things that he ate with greater depth, so to speak, in a way it was bread. Then they noticed that many transactions were made in wheat. Then later, wheat became currency. So let's say we have different types of currencies. We have, for example, lino, coffee, tobacco. In fact, there is a very funny phrase by Milton Friedman that speaks about hyperinflation in Germany. And they say that it was used as money for the slaves, or it was also used for whiskey. No, sorry, cognac. Then he said that it was the definition of money, more liquid than he had ever found in his life. In fact, if you look at the movies of many years of prisons, what was money? Cigarette. I mean, what did the prisoners ask for? They asked for cigarettes. For what? Suddenly they started smoking. There, they used them to exchange inside the jail. Now, what is the problem with this type of good? That does not serve as a reserve of value. I mean, what happened with this type of good is that it degraded them. So it's like having. Chris, no, I pass you another lesson. It's like having a negative interest rate. It's like ice cream. You have an ice cream. As time goes by, it's worthless. That's a negative interest rate. And in fact, what you have to understand, I can't tell you the price of the money, ma'am, because the interest rate exists regardless of the fact that money exists. The interest rate exists because time exists. The interest rate has to do with the mechanism of passing consumption over time. In other words, saving, which is future consumption, is a way of passing consumption over time. So those who are indebted are the ones who advance consumption, and those who are lost are the ones who differ in consumption. And that is still independent of the fact that the central bank exists. That, let's say, the interest rate has to do with the relative price of the present goods with respect to the future goods. It has nothing to do with the monetary issue. It exists because time exists. Otherwise, let's say, there would be no interest rate. It would be an agenda that has no explanation, like the case of Keynes in general theory, error that we have been dragging for a long time, but then to try to preserve the value. Then it went to the metallic currencies, and that's how gold, silver, and bronze appeared. Gold was used for large transactions. Silver was used for smaller transactions. Probably the best known currency of silver was the dollar, which is the dollar today, right? And in that sense, there was also another problem, which was the problem of portability. So there I made the example of the fox. so that the problem could be seen graphically. Then they started with the story of the fox, the version of I don't know what. What do I know? I talked about the version that I saw, let's say, on the iWilliams television. What do I know? The other versions I say. So what I said is that in rigor, let's say, I love that version of the fox. Because it is a real capitalist narco, right? Because what was the fox doing? It was fighting with the scoundrels who stole from the merchants. And it was fighting against the soldiers. This is very interesting, because this is what surprises me. Because instead of capturing the abstraction, they stay in the small letter. Well, that toy, where is Ria? Then, or perhaps I heard him so much, the thought darkened him. That said, but I wasn't talking about Christina. That said, what was going on? If you are going to commercialize, what were you going to go? Either with goods or with gold. So it's like you were carrying a poster on your forehead saying, I have gold. I came to steal, I came to steal. And what did the criminals do? They were going to try to intercept those carts. Because it was a criminal without an archer. There was gold there. In that sense, what is interesting, the fox was fighting against those criminals. Why? Because if they didn't get to the city with the goods, then they had a loss of capital. They ate the effects of the gold coins at that time. They were going to eat the higher level of prices, express and gold. And in that sense, what was going to happen is that no one was going to bring them goods again. And then it's as if they had closed the economy, with which they would have had a huge loss of well-being. So the fox was also a social benefactor, because it protected the roads, so that the thieves would not steal from the merchants. So it was also a free trade party, very liberal. On top of that, it was fighting against monastery and others, with which it was fighting against authority. It was fighting against the issue of tax payments. And therefore, the fox was a narco-capitalist. Don't have any doubts. I mean, it could also be a narco-capitalist, to be at the front of the state, and be like the top of the state that comes to break it. Or what do you think it is to have lowered the public spending by 30%, only after the war? And there are no such great experiences. Having said that, then what did appear? Money or paper. So you left the metal. You left it in one place, and you gave it in exchange for a certificate. Say you then went and paid with that certificate. Obviously, the one who made the pillar was not missing, and issued a certificate without having the gold, the silver, or anything else. Well, obviously, he ended up with a couple of revolts. But the state that did it said, I'm going to do it. And that's where they ruined our currency. So, and that's where the problems of society begin. And central banks are relatively new invention. But here the important thing, the money is a good indirect exchange. I say that the future of history has turned it into a paper. Thus is falsified by the central banks of the world. That's another problem. That's the grey scum of the history of humanity. That is called central bank. But money is a good indirect exchange. And why is it so important to emphasize that it is a good indirect exchange? Because if it is a good indirect exchange, it means that it is a derived demand. I mean, let's see, guys, who of you is thinking of accumulating? What currency to take with you? Let's say to the wooden suit. I mean, it would have to be quite silly. I mean, on the other hand, it doesn't buy anything. I mean, it only buys here. In fiction, which is the visualization that one makes, or someone ever started to think that the amount of ink, let's say, in the banner of a dollar, of $2, of 5, of 10, of 20, of 50, of 100, it's the same. The only thing that changes are the drawings. That is the process and the numbers. But there you are, making a mental representation of that. So what we have to understand is that in the end, the demand for money is a demand for money, a derivative. What do they demand for money for? To demand goods. They don't eat money. They don't eat it. I mean, they take out a bill. Now they try to eat it. But it doesn't work. In fact, they probably don't like it. So in the end, the demand for money is a derivative demand. It's a mirror demand of the demand for goods. And this is interesting, because if it's a mirror of the demand for goods, all the books on macroeconomics that say that the demand for money is a function of income and the interest rate, that's a shock. In reality, the demand for money depends on consumption, and obviously it depends on the entire temporal path of consumption. And if I want to get, let's say, in the background that it's depending on why I don't need to put the income, because if I'm building a system of general balance, why income comes from the sale of leisure in the labor market and comes from the participation that I have in the benefit of the companies. Therefore, I don't have to put the income. That's an aberration. That's a mockery. That Keynes did to be able to invent the effects of adjusting quantities and, above all, invent the multiply that Keynes wanted, which is to violate the budget restriction. Of course, by violating the budget restriction, of course, let's say, if we finance it with monetary emissions, it generates inflation, ma'am. It does generate inflation. If we finance the fiscal deficit with monetary emissions, it generates inflation. And in other countries that have a deficit, they finance it with indebtedness. That is not the central bank. Then it means that if my function, money demand, now depend on my intertemporal consumption path, I have to know what the demand for consumption comes from. When you set up an exercise, you're going to take a microbook, and when you look at the functions of excess demand, of general balance, or the function of demand of a gate, what does it depend on? Of all the prices of the economy, that is, if the income does not appear, it appears in all the prices of the economy. And at the same time, if that economy isn't temporal, it includes today's prices, tomorrow's prices, and so on. It is not necessary to put the interest rate. The interest rate is implicit in the vectors, in a part of the price fact that contains future prices. Therefore, let's say, the demand for money depends on consumption. And this is very interesting, because then, what does it depend on? In the end, the demand for money, that depends on consumption, that depends on those prices. Where does all this come from? From what Robert Lecascinia, who in Peace of Mind, said, the profound parameters, and the profound parameters that are the function of utility, that is preferences, technology, the nations, and the type of economy I have. If it is a private property economy, let's say, but therefore, all those parameters are given. Therefore, in normal conditions, without someone shaking the economy, emitting money like a rat, path of consumption would be determined by these parameters, which are profound parameters and that are given. Therefore, the classic people were not so stupid when they believed as a demand for money was something kinetic. Yes, of course, in normal conditions, pressure and temperature, it is something kinetic. In other words, if the preferences do not change, the technology does not change, the donations do not change, and the intertemporal consumption factor does not change. Therefore, If the demand for money is a granitic structure, the real demand for money, that has to be equal to what? The real demand for money, the GCR, Mohammed Ali or Cassius Clay, as they wanted to call them, called the photographers and said, "Get ready, the knockout is coming. Take the picture, because another knockout is coming for Mrs. Cristina Fernandez Kirchner." If the demand for money is a granitic structure, this is the real demand for money. This has to be equal to the real balance. The real balance is the nominal amount of money over the price level. Naval, the price level will be given by the amount of money that the central bank offers over the demand for money, which is this real demand for money. Therefore, when the central bank emits money, the only thing it does is change the nominal scale. That is, it increases the prices. Note, recess, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess of money supply, either because money is emitted or because the demand for money falls, or both things happen. In fact, I'm going to tell you more. If you could get up, I have already told you. Come on, I'll give you back. In this context, when you have this situation, you generate a loss of the purchasing power of money. This means that all the prices expressed in monetary units go up, and the dollar is one more price of the economy. What happens? Price another one down. There is something called the Cantillon effect, which has to do with what other prices that go up first and what other ones that come back. So, for example, if you had a situation of the fall in the demand for money, that situation, let's say, okay, they don't demand domestic money. What are they going to demand? Well, in principle, they go in demand dollars. That is, they make a portfolio change. Then the price of the dollar jumps. Why? Because it is a financial asset. It adjusts quickly. Now, once that happens, the price of the transceivers goes up. After that, the price of the majorists goes up. After the minorists, and finally, the salary. That's why, let's say, when you have an event of these characteristics, it destroys the workers. I mean, it generates a huge problem. It has to do with a case of a fall in the demand for money. I mean, it's not that the dollar makes the prices go up. No, it's an early indicator in a scenario of these characteristics. And also, it can't always be like that, because actually, what could have happened is that you increase a money supply, then defeat, the demand forgets, then the price goes up. Let's say it come to be the minors' prices as the pressures on the majors, then it pressures on the salaries, and as then they don't give you the numbers. If it's not competitive, the type of change goes up. Do you realize that everything depends on where the excess of supply was generated? Madam, it's a nonsense that the type of change determines the rest of the prices. But later, I'll explain it to you later. Therefore, we, working with general balance, seriously, not like those with 80s who say that they make general balance and cancel a Lagrangian, then, I mean, unless in intertemporal cases, our diagnosis was and is and will continue to be that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess of supply, either because the supply goes up or because the demand falls, or both things happen at the same time. Therefore, in the face of the disastrous scenario we had, that we were going to an inflation of 17.0%, with which the fall of the PPI would have been monstrous, with which the number of poor would have been monstrous as well. We would have been more than 90% of the poor and more than 50% of the poor. That is, we would have replicated the case of Venezuela, was other died. So, our first fundamental idea was to end inflation, to attack inflation, which I warned you that during the campaign, I said that. In addition, monetary policy has a delay of 18 to 24 months. I say because it seems that we should talk, I don't know, in Sanskrit. So, everyone is in a hurry, and it's only been 9 months. Currency my files, not the edited ones. See the complete ones, not the ones that the dirty ones, other journalists, have left over. Not all of them, a large part of them, let's say, added to the store, the information, until I. So go and see the original videos. They are there. So, the issue was to stop the monetary emission. How did we stop the monetary emission? So, one of the sources of emission that there was the financing of the fiscal deficit. When we reached the consolidated fiscal deficit between the Treasury and the National Treasury, there were 15 points of the PBI, where 5 were in the Treasury and 10 in the central bank. Therefore, test that the central bank and the finance secretariat had in front of them, and I have the honor of having it, to the giant of Pablo Kirchner and Vladimir government here. Let's say that they have been great actors. To fix this problem, we had to attack those two sources of money creation. So, what we proposed was the deficit zero. I remember that during the campaign, I went with a chainsaw, and they told me I was crazy because I was going with a chainsaw. In fact, we had broken the agreement with the International Monetary Fund, with which it was a huge difficulty to resolve the fallen agreement, and in that context, we decided to go to the fund and show a plan of deficit zero. The fund was enough for us to fulfill the goals of the previous government. We, madam, you will criticize that government, but you were also part of it. So, in that sense, we had proposed for deficit zero. Obviously, just as during the campaign, they say it was impossible, that we were delusional. I don't know how many more things, the fund with which we could fulfill the program that was fallen by the previous government's disaster, was that it was enough. We proposed the deficit zero. It seemed something very ambitious because it implied an adjustment of 5 points of the PBI and the Treasury Fund, despite the fact that in the last 123 years of history, during 113, we had a fiscal deficit. Only in 10 that we didn't have it. We were in default. It was the first time of these last 123 years that we reached the deficit era, but we didn't do it. It wasn't in a year. We achieved it in the first month of management. 1 year, that's a management. Obviously, all those who said it was impossible to do this, those who repeatedly failed throughout history, and who should call themselves silent, because they are part of the damage and destruction that the Argentines caused. They should have a little more humility, or at least self-criticism. So, what happened? Well, we ended up making an adjustment of the public spending of more than 30%. Then they started to say that it was because we didn't pay, because we drew the numbers. Anything they said, the same thing that the lady says here, is finally with those comments. Those comments were made in January, in February, in March. Let's say today nobody raises those arguments. Let's say that was also the task that we have done, And clearly, today it is understood with clarity that this is a rule of monetary policy that came to stay, and that soon I will go to Congress to present the budget based on the law, let's say, of deficit zero, and that meant that we stopped issuing to finance the tax. Now, the quasi-fiscal, let's say, was generated endogenously, which has to do with the retribution of the remunerated passives of the central bank, and that generated 10 points of deficit, a fiscal deficit, quasi-fiscal, and in that sense, we had to end up with the endogenous emission, and according to show the positive fiscal result and accumulate financial surplus. This giant that is here, Mr. Pablo Cornell, could start to recompose the peso curve, and by being able to recompose the peso curve, he allowed to withdraw the debt that was in the central bank and transfer it to the treasury. That was always the debt of the treasury, because what was it that, for example, did the quasirism? It emitted money with fixed change. It lost reserves. He took the country with $52 billion of reserves and destroyed it. How much did he give it? Federico? Neta minus 5,000. Wonderful, ma'am. But apart from that, the problem of the future dollar, which was like $25,000 million, and in that context, of course, when you met with fixed change, one of the things that happens, they lose reserves. And what did they do? They placed bonds to the central bank. They placed the bond to the central bank, more than $100,000 million, a real scam. And that's how they got the dollars. So, in fact, one of the things that the central bank did recently was to recognize that loss of capital generated by the previous government, by the FRIOA, for example, of $45,000 million. Not only that, but when we started doing this, nobody believed that we could fix a problem of the fiscal quasi world of man. You at one point complained that the real interest rate is negative. I tell you that if we had listened to the economists who proposed to put the real interest rate in positive terms, let's say instead of having 4 remunerated pieces regarding the existing one, today we would have 8, 9, 10. Today the carry trade would be still a discussion, and we would be clearly on the brink of hyperinflation. But we did something else. I tell you that the Brits that you have next to you should study them, because you know what we did? We arbitrated the rate in dollars with the one in pesos, corrected by risk, obviously, and that made the devaluation. The devaluation, ma'am, was already there. That is to say that you hide the data under the carpet. It doesn't mean that the devaluation was there. It was between the parallel dollar and, let's say, the official was close to 3-1. In fact, when we assumed the parallel was around 1300, today it was at 1240. Here's how the Brits suffer. It doesn't matter. There is a business flourishing that is called the production of gasoline for zero mining economists. So, and that no one said how to fix, or that it was impossible, that they propose expropriations. We and these two giants that are here, Pablo and Vladimir, have made the fiscal quarter. Here, what seemed impossible, we did it in 7 months. In other words, in a month we achieved the miracle of deficit zero, and in 7 months we achieved the miracle of ending the fiscal quarter. Well, there is management, gentlemen. The weather. It was not the only bomb that the previous government had left us. It had also left us the problem, the bomb, something that the previous government did as a fiscal deficit, and the International Monetary Fund decided to deal it at a glance. And since the banks did not want to finance the treasury, they preferred to do it with the central bank. The price appeared. But of course, accountably, the POP only gave for the contingent, not for the contingency. But of course, in a scenario of macroeconomic debacle, That was in the money. And obviously, when we enhance the part of the monetary program that is access to man's era, that is, it was no longer issued for the fiscal system. It was no longer issued for the paid parcels, and we were going to go to a phase in which it was only issued by external sector. And we were sitting at the table with the banks discussing the issue of the put. We said to Macro Bank, went and executed the equivalent of $2 billion. That is, I want to know how many times in his life they saw that Argentina was attacked by $2 billion in one day and the economy resisted. Another miracle. That is, there is more strength in this guy than we think. In that sense, we could also take over the put hands in the face of the possibility. Thus, another situation, a case of macro instability with Minister Caputo, who will be remembered in the textbooks as the best minister of economy in history. We decided in conference, also with Santiago Borsali, to go to a deeper stage of the monetary policy. That is to go to the zero emission crisis. Basically, the problem was that we, following the textbooks, believed that the purchase of dollars was based on money demand, and therefore, if the money demand was based on the supply, it would not generate inflation. However, one of the things that was not in the textbooks and that we discovered is that, of course, when there's capital control, that is not necessarily true. What happens when you have free capital mobility, and if you want to make transactions in pieces, you go with your dollars and you buy the pesos from the central bank, and with those pesos, you have a real operation. Therefore, in that case, it is money demand, and therefore, in that case, it does not generate inflation. The problem arises that when you have SIPO, which we basically have to fix the problem of stocks that the previous government left us. Ma'am, I did not stop being a liberal libertarian. What happens is that I'm a liberal libertarian, not a libertarian. So I also understand the economy's problems of stocks and flows. So if I had 4 monetary bases in one day, if I had savings in pesos for the equivalent of $90,000 million, if I had $50,000 million in debt and share, and it is like if I did not decide that it did not end well. It ended quite badly. I understand that this is what the previous government wanted, that we act as libertarians, that everything was set on fire, and by January, let's say after done, supermarket explosion and so on, the Baroness liturgy cut, return and definitely till any kind of freedom. In my sense, we do economics seriously. That is, we do not only do economics from the textbook. So, in fact, what happened in terms of interest rates is a great triumph that we have also had in terms of economic theory, because what did the Akhenates tell us? That we had to raise the interest rate. If we had raised the interest rate, the central bank would have exploded. In this way, having jumped the exchange rate to a level similar to the parallel exchange rate corrected by the country's tax. In that context, what happened? That the interest rate in dollars arbitrated with the one in pesos. for the one in pesos implied being negative in real times, and this also allowed us to liquefy the stock of pesos. That's for you to learn, man. In monetary theory, it's not only a matter of looking at flows, the stocks are also looked at. And sometimes the problem of the stocks is much bigger than what one imagines, because in fact it generated a quasi-fiscal deficit, which was twice the fiscal deficit. In that sense, we then decided to go to something more radicalized, because what happens when you have control of capital, which we need to have until we finish fixing the stock problems and until we finish cleaning the money overhand, and the money overhand will disappear when the inflation is zero. The induced side, the macroeconomic is zero. You have the absurd and the induced. The macroeconomic is the one in the middle. That is that residue, which today, let's say, a majority is 0.5 and consumers it's 1.5, and which, let's say, is on the way to disappear. In that context, what happens when you have control of capital? The exporters are forced to liquidate in the bulk. And what's the problem with that? That exporter isn't necessarily buying money. What we do have clear is that he's selling dollars. And notice that when there's the bulk and the control of capital is wanting to buy money is not the same as having to sell dollars. That difference is fundamental, because then those dollars went entering because they wanted money. Those dollars are entering because there's a regulation that imposes it. So that generated an expansion, a amount of money beyond demand, and that's why inflation persists. That's why inflation persists. Not because there are indexing mechanisms, because there are inflationary inertia. No, because let's say this happened, let's admit it, more than what was demanded. So to correct this, we go to a deeper phase of the program that is zero emission, and it's not intervention, because the level of intervention falls, because if they liquidate $3, so to speak, and I met for $3, my level of intervention is $3. Now, if I have a gap and I return dollars, so that weight or constant, I guess with the gap of $30, I have $1 in a central bank, and I return two to the market. I'm not intervening. I'm doing that. The amount of money is constant. Or what other way do you think? What do you want? That it sterilizes and pays interest rates again. So if you look, the intervention went from 3 to 1. Therefore, in this balance, there's less intervention, and it's much more similar to a market-free balance than to an intervention balance. Why? Because when there's no intervention, zero intervention, how would it be? The variation of the type of change is free. The variation of the amount of money is zero, and the variation of reserve is zero. And there appears another topic, the one that, let's say, the central bank doesn't buy dollars. It falls into default. Could it be that we're so worried? I mean, barbarity is so great. I understand that. The doctor says this because she's not an economist. She's supposed to be a liar, but she doesn't show us the title either. So, let's say she was a lawyer. It seems like she doesn't know that. She's not part of her training. How do you think the delirium, that the debt has to be paid with dollars bought by the central bank in the market? I mean, what you're saying with that is that they're going to emit money to buy dollars, and those dollars, after the state is going to come, the treasury is going to note the dollars. It's going to leave back public titles with which it's being scammed back, and it's being scammed with its own seniority. If you want, let's say, a more rudimentary version, easy to understand, although incorrect, the inflationary tax. So, what are you telling me? That I have to annihilate the Argentinians with inflation to pay the debt? No, guys. The debt is paid with the tax superior, not like an idiot buying dollars in the market emitting money. That's the only thing that generates inflation. So, the dollars to pay the debt are bought with the tax superior. That's what we're doing. And then I want to go to a question of the discussion of indigenous money or not, because it's incredible. Let's say the lady says that the type of change is the one that determines the inflation or the prices, or if you want devaluation, it determines the inflation. In the end, I tell you that that's applying the PPP in saying that the domestic price is the international price for the type of change. I tell you, lady, that's consistent with the quantitative theory. In fact, you know what? A man named David Hume, who later was taken by Adam Smith and was taken by the classics, therefore far from being contemplated. In fact, if the domestic price level is determined in the monetary plan, while the money supply divided by the real money demand, and that applies the same in the world. The type of change that is given by the local price divided by the international price means that it is given by what are called relative monetary conditions. I'll tell you the story. A local supply divided by the international supply, the international demand divided by the international demand divided by the local demand. So if you, as the conditions of the world are given to us, if the amount of money rises or if the demand from many falls, that, let's say, impacts the prices, but it also impacts the type of change. That is, you realize that they don't even have consistency in what they say. Moreover, it is also interesting to discuss that model, because in the end, what is it that they say? Well, the problem with inflation is the lack of dollars. Total nonsense. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Of course, they start from the idea that the local demand is the type of change multiplied by the international one, and that the type of change is determined by the excess, let's see, it will be moving with the excess demand for currency. So of this solution, that is to export more. That is, more excess demand for goods is rare. What is the other solution? Default, restructure. And those are the solutions that they propose to lower inflation. They seem quite comical. Do you know why? Because in addition, they did all of them, and then nothing. They allege the external restriction. Another stupidity, the size of a house. How does the model of external restriction work? You stimulate the demand. It makes the GDP grow. That makes the import rise. And if they cannot be financed, then you have a limit to the expansion of the GDP by external restrictions. Do you know why that happens? Because there is fixed price. Leave flexible price, the external restriction disappears. The external restriction exists in a model of fixed price. If you release the prices, there is no external restriction. And fixed prices, let's say, fixing the type of change with tax deficit and issuing was what made all the reserves slide and destroy. Today, Argentina should have, if they had done things in a reasonable way, today Argentina should have about $120,000 to $150,000 million of reserves, and we don't have them, precisely because of the monetary populism, of the Kaiserism, because of these barbarities. So, in addition, it is interesting, because they say, no, the problem is not tax, because there is a hypothesis that says that the problem is tax. If I have a tax deficit of finance with monetary emission, and that's what generates inflation, they say no, it has nothing to do with tax deficit. It's funny because it says that then, but the problem is the excess demand of the currency that generates the debt. I say, and where did the debt come from? It's from a rest. The debt is the daughter of the tax deficit. Man, it's called budget restriction. Try to see what happens to you when you spend more than you enter it. It's a debt, and that piece of interest. If that started because you were in debt, and who was in debt? For $450,000 million. The previous governments. I'm going to tell you something. We lower the debt, so we are doing our job. Therefore, there is also a contradiction in their times. But of course, they believe that prices are generated by a Malkan cost, that is, value theory, objective value theory. That is, they went back to before 1871. I'll tell you something. I read Mincher, and I'm proud to be Austrian. In that sense, it is clear why they have caused us so much damage and continue to cause so much damage. And it is interesting, because this kind of stupidity is not only felt by Alcoiserism, there are many more people who think about these things, and these things are the ones that made Argentina, being the richest country in the world, fall to the middle of the table, starting from being the richest country in the world in the last 50 years. We multiply poverty by at least 10 times. That is in the country that produces food for 500 million human beings, and the tax is taken 70%, that is fit for 350 million human beings. There are 5 million Argentinians who do not have enough to eat. That is the disaster that they generated. They generated it in the entire political caste, not us who came to fix all these gaps. And I'll give you one more fact, because they say no, the PPI fell, the PPI fell. It is very interesting. As you take the PPI fallen on first quarter, which is when we do the whole thickness of the adjustment. In fact, we overreact to it. The adjustment, the PPI in the first quarter fell 5%. I remind you that being Peronism in power in the year 2002 was an agreement with a man called Alfonsin. They were put to the IAEF, and in that context, it is very interesting because they made a much smaller adjustment, and the PPI in the second quarter of the year, when they made the adjustment, fell 16%. Therefore, 5% is something quite remarkable compared to the fact that we made a much bigger adjustment. If I tell you something, because in the last quarter of the previous year, the PPI had already fallen 2.5%. And when you look at the stationing of the first quarter, it fell 2.6%, with which that say it was not something so alarming, and I'm growing Citari more. The other day I was having dinner with Public Secretary, and he made me notice something that I had not noticed, and that is that if you take the ME, which is the proxy of the PPI in the monthly version, if you take it to stationed and take the last observation against December, the PPI fell 2%. Therefore, let's say not only are we making the biggest adjustment in history, we are lowering inflation, but also the activity did not fall so much. I understand this is very painful for the political caste. We are showing them that they are useless, that they are useless at all, that the only thing they do is harm, and that taking the state out of the middle favors us and is not harmful. It is something that improves our quality of life, not only because of what we earn in freedom, but also because we are more productive. But they also predicted that we were going to have a social catastrophe, a catastrophe we did not have. Why? Because from the Ministry of Human Capital, while we made the adjustment in parties that do hurt politics. Today, if you take the universal child assignment, plus the feed card. Today 99% of the basic feed basket is covered, when the previous government left it around 60%. Therefore, our social policy is also much better, but I am going to give you fact that is not in the correction. When Minister Javier decided to remove the provision of the contraprestation and social programs, let's say everyone put the scream in the sky and said, well now, let's say, they're fostering bargains. They did not realize what we were doing. Like what we were doing was very simple. When you live in a social program, although there was a card with which they charged, then they had to go to account for the contraprestation and they had to sign it. And that's where the coin remained. That's where the poverty managers ended up. Everyone was talking that they had to end up with the poverty managers. We are the ones who end up with the poverty managers. And that was achieved in a battle since the first day that they gave Minister Borch and the side of the street control, Minister Javier cutting this carol. Because look how interesting, because now, if you cut, they did not charge and they were not forced to go to the marches, because they did not have to go to give the contraprestation. That in the end, the contraprestation is that they went to the marches to make a mess. So, of course, when we announced that they would end up with that contraprestation in a few days, they announced a stop Oslo bounty. Of course, because we were cutting the mechanism by which they were stealing the money to the beneficiaries of social privileges. And at that moment, he said that 50,000 people were going to go, because of course he thought that 100,000 were going to go, and so he shared it as a success. And the truth is that they ended up going nothing more than 3,000. There were more police officers than people, and it allowed us to win the street. And also, you have three types of war. You have the war that is stocks against stocks, leasing the one now, and first of all, it's so to speak in some way. There's one now, there's flow, that say there is a spew because let's say it never ends. But there's one that is stock and flows, the war that the pickets raised us, and all this social disorder was flow. I mean, and the state itself put the money to those who broke things. And what did they say? That it was impossible to end up with the pickets. What did we do? We cut that cable, and it was a better love. Flows the state against stocks, the pickets. The stocks were finished, and the pickets were finished. 4 months ago, what seemed impossible, we have been without pickets for 4 months, while we are managing. Finally, coming to how the monetary policy for the future and how the exit of the SIPO is going to be. Again, the first thing you have to understand is that I can set dates. I understand that. They have their brains mistreated for years of collectivism. But did any of you ever think about demanding the central bank a year to know where the interest rate is going to be? I mean, they ask us for things. They need to tell us how much the interest rate is going to be. Let's say a minute, a delirium. I mean, you move forward by objectives. And the point is that these achievements depend on the decisions of the individuals. Therefore, it is endogenous. I mean, when, let's say, we could end up with a passive remuneration, and when the individuals wanted to couch you, treasury that side, we have the monetary base, observes the traditional one. So, as long as the traditional monetary base, as a result of the increase in the demand for money, leads to the disarmament of remuneration positions, you're not only going to have a situation where the two bases are met, but the opposite of that is our money is overhand and the inflation is zero. When I say zero inflation, I mean the difference between the observed and the induced. When we are in that situation, the only inflation that is going to be is that the observed is equal to the induced. And then we can open the net. And we don't need dollars because the demand for money is based on the offer of money. And why is this important? First, look at this. Because this is very important. Economic activity, despite what they said, is recovering in a very interesting way and that naturally leads to an increase in the demand for money. That increase in the demand for money, what happens? The companies you have to understand, they need to generate working capital. And if they need working capital, what are they going to do? They go to the money market. When they leave the money market to demand working capital, which is the demand for money, he starts disarming what? The repaid positions in the banks. And that's why the banks leave the repaid positions and ask for cash. So that's generating that demand for money leads to the traditional monetary base, to the wide monetary base. So what is the great risk? So here is that we have left the money supply constant and the demand for money is growing. Obviously what is happening in the middle is that the money overhand is being cleaned and you are going to have less and less inflation. Once we get to that point, what is the problem now? That the monetary base coincided with the wide one. It is that now the demand for money can continue to grow and the money supply does not grow anymore. And in that case, what is the risk? The risk that there is deflation. And the problem is that as the speed of adjustment in the financial markets is faster than in the real market, the type of change strongly falls on you and leads, let's say, to the collapse of companies and to a slowdown of economic growth. And what did we say about this? Monetary competition. Why do we talk about monetary competition? Let's suppose that the two currencies were only the peso and the dollar. And in fact, he can do it today. That is why the case of Diaco is so wonderful. That it accepts that it is paid in dollars. So you automatically see what you are generating. You do not have to be throwing the dollars and the market and generate a brutal appreciation. You start making transactions in dollars. The monetization of the economy will be done by individuals, as always. And they will do it by putting dollars and making transactions in dollars. And what is interesting about this? That the amount of peso will continue to be fixed. That they will have a type of market change that will not experience a jump because offer and demand of dollars is matched. And as economic growth increases, there will be more dollars with respect to the peso. And in a moment, the amount of dollars will be so much bigger and the amount of peso that we will be able to close the central bank and so will end for life the cancer of Argentine inflation. Thank you very much.